Welcome back to A Year of Final Fantasy, and today we're going to be diving in headfirst on the Ivalice project. Similarly as we did in July with the Final Fantasy VII compilation, each video this month, other than the first one that I already did, is going to go over one of the major games in detail, but let's just talk about right now what this project actually was and what it tried to accomplish. So what is the Ivalice Alliance? Well, it's one of the few experiments that Square's been taking with Final Fantasy, and it's interesting because since Final Fantasy itself is mostly disjointed, each game takes on a form of its own. However, there are a few times when the fans or the developers really latch on to a particular world that they've built and wants to explore that setting more. And actually, even though technically the Ivalice Alliance didn't come along until much later, the first game thought to be in that whole project is Final Fantasy Tactics, one of the most beloved Final Fantasy games of all time. But some other similar projects are, for instance, the Crystal Chronicles franchise that I talked all about in March. Of course, I already talked about the Final Fantasy VII compilation project that we did in July. Another one is going to be the Fabula Nova Crystallis project, which we're going to be covering next month with Final Fantasy XIII. And Final Fantasy XIII, you know, that's everyone's favorite game. Everyone's going to totally love all those videos, right? Regardless, anyway, here we're talking about the spin-off of Final Fantasy Tactics and the games that it inspired with its setting of Ivalice. Interestingly, there are 4 main games that are quote-unquote properly under this weird Ivalice Alliance banner, even though it does span much more than 4 games. So really, in my view, the Ivalice Alliance is kind of a formality like, oh, hey, we're making all of these games in the same world. Let's Ivalice Alliance, right? Like they got about halfway into it and like, oh, we should probably name this. So the 4 major kind of proper games here developed under the Ivalice Alliance are Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions, Final Fantasy Tactics A2 Grimoire of the Rift, and Final Fantasy XII The International Zodiac Job System, of which we just got a remake for this year on the PlayStation 4. However, there's a lot more games set in Ivalice that we're going to talk about, and they deserve to be looked at. And they are Final Fantasy XII, just a regular game, Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced, Final Fantasy Tactics. It's a game called Dive to Hunt. There's also something called Adventure of Sorbet, kind of sounds like a Dragon Ball name or something. Vagrant Story, which was the mystical game that I mentioned before, that isn't actually properly a Final Fantasy game, but it has been retroactively set in Ivalice. And we'll go into a lot more details with that later on whenever we talk about it. There also is a game that was supposed to come out for this called Fortress, which very few people know about at all. There's Crystal Defenders, and there's Final Fantasy Tactics S. And as far as this project goes, we're going to be covering Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactics Advanced, Tactics A2, Vagrant Story, and Revenant Wings, along with finishing off the month with Final Fantasy XII. So some of these remaster, remake games are going to be lumped in with their counterparts. For instance, Final Fantasy Tactics on the PlayStation, and then the Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions kind of remaster-ish remake. Those will all be together. So the developer who spearheaded this whole thing was named Yasumi Matsuno, who created the world of Ivalice as a medieval setting, and his first game actually at Squaresoft was Final Fantasy Tactics. What a pleasure to be hired and then make one of the most beloved games of all time. It's crazy. So like I said, originally a spin-off game of the original franchise, Final Fantasy Tactics introduced the setting, and the fans obviously adored Ivalice, and Square took note, and it gave us all of these other games in that particular setting. Other games came along, such as Vagrant Story, which I already talked about it not being set in Ivalice until later on. And it's actually pretty fitting that Vagrant Story is part of Ivalice, even though it may not originally have meant to been, because that is Yasumi Matsuno's second game. That was Vagrant Story, which is a fantastic game, and it was coming hot off the heels of Final Fantasy Tactics. In fact, you know what? I'm going to leave that for the Vagrant Story video. So even beyond those games, Ivalice has a far-reaching presence in the Final Fantasy franchise as a whole. In fact, if you play Final Fantasy XIV, there was recently introduced a raid with the new expansion that is a return to Ivalice, which is like nobody thought of that at all. And going back to the actual setting of Ivalice, it's kind of a touchy subject to talk about with timeline theorists, as it's ripe for speculation about different things. Most notably, though, is the absence of different races in Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. Of course, the actual explanation is that those games were just simply created before the modern games of Ivalice that have these races. But, as always, gamers and lore enthusiasts love to have that in-game continuity, and interestingly enough, there's never been necessarily a definitive, like 100% definitive explanation of what exactly happened to the other races, but most prevailing theory here is that they were subjugated by the church. The church does play a very, very large part in the whole setting. And to be even more specific, Ivalice was mostly inspired by ancient Mediterranean and European Gothic history. It's a very, very tough world for sure. Getting back to the timeline, it's generally said to be that Final Fantasy XII came first, then Revenant Wings, then Tactics A2, then the original Tactics, then Vagrant Story, and then There's some other games there, but I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to tell you what those games are because I'd like you to find out for yourself. So this whole timeline stuff, it's not really as complicated as, say, the Zelda timeline, because the developers of this Ivalice series, this Tactics series, actually did try to explain away some of the inconsistencies that they found, and they've done it fine. And whenever they did that, that's just been retroactively applied to everything. And even in games to come, if there are games to come, they're going to still hold to those rules. It's just they simply didn't think of the rules at the time. So theorizing about this and looking at lore is always interesting, so I'm glad they chose to do this. And that's about it for Ivalice and this whole Ivalice Alliance project, at least explaining what it is. Next time we're going to take a proper dive into the game of Final Fantasy Tactics and its remaster on the PlayStation Portable, which is surnamed War of the Lions. And Final Fantasy Tactics is a game that most people put right alongside the major numbered Final Fantasy games, and it is a fantastic one, no doubt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you're looking forward to this month of the Phoenix and Ivalice. And as always, until next time, here's the Warriors keep on gaming.